Well, we are finishing up a series, message in the series on commitments that I've made that are very helpful, and I want you to kind of get this. I think it'll be helpful for all of us if we can put a few of these things into practice that we've talked about over the last few weeks. You'll remember 4 weeks ago, I said every morning before I get out of the bed, I roll over on one shoulder and I say, God, today I want to have a good attitude. A good attitude. And I go through the whole thing. What does that mean? I want to take the high road, not the low road. I want to give people the benefit of the doubt. I want to see the cup as half full, not half empty. I want to not be a whiner and a complainer. I want to believe that what my best days are in front of me, not behind me. I want to think all of those things. And I go through that. I do that process. Then the next thing I say is, and I do this every day, Lord, I want to live in your flow. I believe you are flowing all around me. I believe that you are touching people, blessing people. You're moving in love everywhere. And when I am in that flow, I seem to have life better than I ever could know it. But sometimes, Lord, because of my actions, I step out of the flow. Lord, if I step out of the flow today, help me be smart enough to quickly step back into the flow. Don't let me live outside of the flow for long. And I hope you'll do that. Step back into the flow. Then last week I talked about a third thing, affirmation I do every day. Lord, help me be grateful. You have given me what is most important in this life, love, joy, peace in my heart. You've shown to me forgiveness. You have given me a second chance and a third chance and 100th chance. You love me. You are merciful to me. I want to be grateful for that, oh Lord. I want to be grateful for that. And now our fourth piece to this sermon series, and this is all very, very much a part of what I try to do. I say, Lord, I want today to be a good neighbor. I want to be a good neighbor. So I want to ask you, would you be my neighbor? Would you be my neighbor today? Such an amazing word is that word neighbor. Such a simple word. I've been thinking about it these last days. I want you to do something with me. I've just been kind of going back down memory lane, thinking about my childhood when I first really began to grasp what neighbors were like. Did you have good experience with neighbors when you were growing up? Boy, I did. I had some of the coolest friends in the world that lived right around me. Oscar Schlomer lived right across the street from me. Oscar was a year older than me. His dad was in the Army, and we always thought his dad was the meanest guy in the whole neighborhood because he just had that Army demeanor about him. But Oscar and I, we played ball together every day. We'd play baseball in baseball season. We'd play football in football season and basketball in basketball season. My house was where the basketball goal was, and the living room window was right close to the basketball goal. And every year, at least once, guess what? Basketball go through the window, but my mom and dad didn't mind. They liked that we were playing. If we were there and we were playing, if it happened, it happened. Then we went through a season where we rode bikes. How many of y'all were bike riders? Any of y'all ride trails? Man, we would ride the trails, and I look back now and think we were crazy stuff that we would do on bicycles. We actually would build ramps. Did any of y'all build the ramps? We would build ramps with tires and a big wooden board, and then we would put people on the other side of the ramp. We would lay people down. I was kind of always the leader. I always had a leader kind of a mentality. So where did I get? I got the closest to the ramp, right? I'm right. You got to just fall off the ramp to land on me. Where'd I put my younger sister? She is the last person. Like, you're going to play with us, you got to go where I tell you to go. It's a miracle she didn't die, because we would come flying down the hill and we would take off in the ramp, and we never killed anybody, but we could have. I mean, if we had landed right on her. And then I remember this. Steve Hooks was a great friend of mine. I still talk to him from time to time. Steve Hooks lived down the street from me, and we got into a little season where we played tennis a little bit, and my mom had said, you cannot go play until you wash the dishes. Now, she was at work. So what did I do? Steve Hooks' mother had a dishwasher. We did not have a dishwasher, so I put all the dishes in a bag, and I took them down to Steve Hooks' house, and we put them in his dishwasher. And then we went and played tennis, and then I got the dishes back and took them home, and we thought we were so smart until about a week later, Steve's mom was saying, where did this dish come from? Because we had left one, and my mom was saying, where did that dish go? And we finally had to say, okay, that's what we did. Neighbors were wonderful back then. But then sadly, I became an adult, and I stopped hanging out with my neighbors. I stop talking to them. It's really crazy what happens. Yet Jesus said so much about neighbors. He spoke about it all the time. And maybe he knows more about life than we do, and maybe we ought to listen to what he's saying about how we're supposed to interact with neighbors. If you have your Bibles, I want you to look at Matthew chapter 22. I want you to look at one of the examples of when Jesus talked about neighbors. Short little story, but I think it'll give us a great launching place. The Bible says in verse 35, one of them, an expert in the law, tested Jesus with this question: Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? One question: which is the greatest commandment in the law? He's not asking for a plurality of answers. He is asking for one answer. Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. Now, the man who asked the question was an expert in the law. Just for a little background, we should not think of this man as a criminal or a civil attorney like we have in our society today. In Jesus' world, criminal and civil and religious law all ran together. Religious leaders were equally legal consultants. So the title for this man implies he might have been a Pharisee. More likely than not, he was a priest who served as a legal expert when he was not working at the temple. This unnamed priest, or at least Pharisee, approaches Jesus respectfully, uses a dignified title: Teacher, what is the single most important commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. Now, this would be considered a normal, good, fantastic rabbi answer. This was important. It was taken right from what was considered the most important text in the Old Testament. It's in the Old Testament book called Deuteronomy, chapter 6, verse 4. We talked about it last week. Do you remember what we said that was called? The Shema. You remember that? The Shema. This was Judaism's number one declaration. Jews would say this every morning and every night. This is what the verse says: Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Him shall you love with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. This was the very first prayer children in Israel would memorize. They called it the Shema. Shema, by the way, is the first word in that verse. Hear, that's the Hebrew word, Shema, Shema. These words were fundamental to Israel's life. They were spoken in the morning and they were spoken in the evening. They also were combined with the Ten Commandments, and they were often written on small scrolls and placed on doorposts. That's called the mezuzah. If you ever go into a Jewish person's house, almost 100% of the time when you go into a Jewish person's house, they will have on the side of the door usually a brass scroll, and that brass scroll is called a mezuzah. It represents the Shema and the Ten Commandments, and they have it on their front door post and they have it on their back door post. Also, Jews would strap it in a little box on their head. This was called the phylacteries. And they also would wrap this, a small scroll, they would wrap it in a ceremonial leather strap around their arm. This was called the tefillin. The Shema was a big deal. Every Jew hearing Jesus would say, you're exactly right, love God with all your heart. Jesus, good answer. You're just staying with what everybody else who's a religious leader would say to us. Good answer. But then Jesus does something very unexpected. Something actually quite staggering. He adds this amendment to it. Verse 39. And the second is like it. What, you are putting something else equal to the Shema? We ask for one commandment. What is the most important commandment? You give us the Shema, and then you say, oh, and this is equal to it? Love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. What do you mean, second? The second is like the first. The guy didn't ask for two. But Jesus says the second is just as important. Who has the authority, by the way, to amend the sacred Shema? Nobody would be that bold to say what you believe is number one. But there is another one that stands right beside it. Love your neighbor as yourself. This is very important to Jesus. There is a theme in Judaism, and of course Jesus was a Jew. We don't want to ever forget that. He was a Jew that was always present, but it's not always resonant in how the Jews behaved. It always had a danger of becoming lost. It is that notion that love for God and love for people is inextricably tied together. You cannot have one without the other. You can't love God and not love people. It's tied together. So Jesus, in an act of breathtaking authority that no one else would do, absolutely brilliantly weds these two together in a way that would, quite frankly, revolutionize the world. Religion, true religion, is to love God and to love people equal. Now, it's very important to understand what the Bible means when it says to love your neighbor, because there's a lot of confusion about what love is. A lot of people think that love is a fuzzy feeling that you get, and I want you to know that. This is not a sentimental word. There's nothing soft about this word. And the best definition of it I know is, and you may want to write this down, to love your neighbor is to intend their good. To intend their good. And love is what your life is to be all about. If you do not love people, you cannot love God. And Jesus quoted this thought not one time, not two times, but he quoted it 8 different times in the Gospels. Do you think it was a big deal to him? It was the biggest deal to him. Jesus says this so often that now for 2,000 years we have called this thought, love God and love people, the Great Commandment. It is the Great Commandment. Here's a good quote I'd like you to write down. Write this down. You cannot succeed at life and fail at love. And you cannot fail at life if you succeed at love. Love is what your life is all about. Tiffany, tweet that tomorrow and say, Pastor Ray said that. Okay, just want to count the words. You cannot succeed at life and fail at love. And you cannot fail at life if you succeed at love. Love is what your life is all about. Now, I want to talk about what neighbor means just for a minute. And I want to say to you the primary meaning of the word, the initial meaning of the word is proximity. Jesus is saying right out of the gate, you need to love those that you live the closest to. It's not just about loving abstract groups of marginalized people who are conveniently located on the other side of the planet, although you need to care for those people, but we're talking about people that share space with you. We're talking about people that maybe even share your home. That's the closest neighbor to you, and then certainly those people that live close by, and then, of course, there are other meanings beyond that. Let me give you the etymology of the word neighbor. Some of you maybe like to know where words come from. Nay, the first part of neighbor actually comes from the word nigh, and nigh means close to. You know, if I said to you, if I said, Tyler, draw nigh to me, draw nigh, that would be a way to say come close to me. That's where the nay part comes from. And then bur is a Dutch word, and it means to dwell. So neighbor, nigh-bur, means to dwell in close proximity to. That's what the word actually means. Now I want to talk about loving that person that's close to you. And I want to say this too. I think people, those neighbors that live in our community, I think it's harder to love those people when we live outside of the perimeter maybe than when we live inside the perimeter, but based on how our houses are built. How many live outside of the perimeter? Can I see your hands? And I know y'all are wonderful people here. How many people live inside the perimeter, inside 285? That's most of us. In Jesus' day, everybody connected with people that lived around them because they couldn't go in their house. There was no electricity in their house. People basically didn't live inside the walls of their house. They lived outdoors with each other. Even up to 100 years ago, architects used to build houses with something called front porches on it. But then something happened. Around World War II, this feature in homes changed, and guess what we started doing? We started building homes with garage door openers and secluded backyards, which allow people now to drive into their garage and then they go to their backyard to grill out, and they never have to talk to neighbors ever. Before I moved to East Point 7 years ago, I lived for 10 years in the same house. After 10 years, I knew not one person's name on our street. And that's not exaggeration. That is the truth. I did not know one person's name on the street. Well, you see the boxes on your outline? I want to give you a little test. The boxes on your outline represent the houses behind you, beside you, and in front of you where you live. I want to take just a minute or two, and I want to see how many of those boxes you can fill in. Ready? Go. Anybody recognize the jazz tune we were playing? Won't you be my neighbor? Elevator? No, it was Mr. Rogers, Won't You Be My Neighbor? And I was wondering if anybody would pick up on that. Elevator music. How many of you are able to fill out all the names? Some of y'all. I'm in total awe. Some of y'all, that is fantastic. How many of you didn't do so well? I'm with you. I get it. That was me a few years ago. On average, churches across America, 10% of the people are able to fill out every person in those blocks. They call this study, by the way, or that chart you just did, the chart of shame. The chart of shame, because it's kind of convicting when you look at it and you think, sheesh, Jesus said, love my neighbors. I can't even name who my neighbors are. I don't even know who they are. Over the next several weeks between now and Christmas, I'm going to ask everybody here to learn how to fill in those names. Find out who those people are. I'm going to ask you to do that. Get to know who they are. And I know it's going to be harder for some than others. Some of you are introverts, and it's harder. It takes more energy. Some are extroverts. It maybe is a little bit easier. But I'm just going to ask you to do that. And I want you to really think about learning to love those people that have proximity close to you. Second little story I want to get into is another time when Jesus talked about neighbors. So let's shift gears. We had the first conversation where Jesus said this commandment's just as important as the first. Love God, love each other, or love your neighbors. Now, second conversation happens like this. A lawyer comes to Jesus and asks him, how can he have eternal life? And the lawyer said, I understand I'm supposed to love God and love your neighbor. And Jesus said, you're right. Do that and you're going to live. But then the message translates like this. The man says, look at the scripture, Luke 10:29, looking for a loophole, he asked, and just how would you define neighbor? How would you define neighbor, Jesus? Now, this was a great debate that was going on in Israel at the time because they had endured oppressions from the Greeks and the Romans and the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and they were drawing lines of demarcation regularly about who they were obligated to love. So they wanted to know, who are we supposed to love? We don't think we're supposed to love everybody. Some taught you were to exclude non-Pharisees. One rabbinic saying taught that heretics or informers or renegades should be pushed into the ditches and not retrieved. So the lawyer says, who am I obligated to love? And Jesus says, let me tell you a story. And Jesus begins to tell the story that you know as the Good Samaritan. He begins by saying a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he was attacked by robbers who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Let me just give you a picture. There is a guy now on the side of the road. He is totally naked. His social status and nationality cannot be identified by clothes or by speech. He is a naked mass of humanity. He is a man in human need, and that's all we know, raw human need. So 3 men walk by, Jesus says. The first guy that walks by is a priest. He sees him, and he gets over on the other side of the road. Second man that walks by is a Levite. He sees him. No compassion from the Levite. He walks over on the other side of the road. So the crowd is listening and they're thinking, okay, we get this. Jewish stories often had three parts. When Jesus told the prodigal son story, there was the part about the lost sheep and the lost coin and then the lost son. So Jesus is going to tell one of those stories with three parts. So there's the priest that walked by and the Levite walked by. And so now he's going to tell us that it was a lowly Jewish layperson walked by and saw this guy and was compassionate to him. But Jesus does not say a lowly Jewish person walked by. Jesus says in verse 33, a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was. And when he saw him, he took pity on him. We've talked about the Samaritans before, who they were. After Israel, which was unified under King Saul, King David, and King Solomon, they split. The northern kingdom was overtaken by the Assyrians. They forced the Jews to intermarry with the Assyrians. That produced children that were not pure Jews, at least as known by the southern kingdom, who was overtaken by the Babylonians. They never intermarried, so they saw themselves superior to the Samaritans. The Samaritans were those half-breeds. They hated them. And Jesus said, not a good Jew walked by, but a Samaritan walked by and helped this person. That would be like me saying a preacher walked by and didn't help, and then a choir member walked by and didn't help, and then a Muslim walked by and saw a person in their need, or a Hindu walked by, or an atheist walked by. It would be stunning to us. We like to keep it in the family. But Jesus is so different. Jesus says, this guy went to him, bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey and brought him to an inn and took care of him. The Samaritan actually walked 17 miles with the man on his donkey to take him for help. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave to the innkeeper and said, you look after him, and when I return I'll reimburse you for any extra expenses that you have. And just to put it into financial terms, the Samaritan supplied 24 days worth of care based on the economy of the day. 24 days of care. Try to figure that out. If you're thinking $50 at a day's inn, you were talking about a lot of money he gave and said, you take care of this man. I'll come back and pay any bills that you have when I come back through town. Then Jesus said, which of these 3 men were neighbors? Well, obviously it was the Samaritan that was the neighbor. It was the Samaritan. And so the story ends with Jesus saying, who is the neighbor? And the expert of the law says, it was the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus said, you go and do likewise. Now, I've been thinking about that all week, because when I prop up on my elbow and I say, Lord, I want to be a good neighbor, what does that mean? And I want to quickly close with 3 quick thoughts. 3 observations on neighbors that maybe will help you. First thing is this: my closest neighbors are those who live in the same house as me, which means Jane. She is my closest neighbor. Now, why are you saying that? I'm saying that because I have known people who are preachers and teachers of the Bible and lay leaders in their church who are mean and harsh to their own families. They would give money to help a starving child in Africa, but they won't give 5 minutes of their time to their own child who is starving for affection. And I want you to know that that cannot be. That cannot be. Our family should be where more love is shown than anywhere else. And we need to not have arrogance and think because we're Christians that means our families are better than other families. I have seen families that are far better families who are not Christians than some of the Christian families that I've seen. I've seen some dysfunctionally sick, destructive, horrible, pathetic, mean-spirited Christian homes. But that should not be. You need to love your mate. You need to love your partner. You need to love your children. They ought to feel that from you. You ought to help shoulder the responsibilities of the house with them. We have a principle around here called the filling station principle. When Jane goes and keeps grandkids all day Tuesday, her tank gets totally depleted. When she comes home, I need to be thinking, her tank is depleted. How can I help fill her tank back up? She does that for me all the time. She's always thinking, how can I fill his tank back up? We should be thinking about how can we serve each other, help each other, love each other. Those are our closest neighbors. Observation number 2. By the way, talk about that. When you leave church, talk about that with your partner. Talk about that. Second thing, connecting with and showing love to people who live close to me is a beautiful way to live out my faith. And I need to learn how to do it better. Sadly, churches have been a hindrance to this in the past. We have crowded our calendars with so many activities that sometimes people could not love their neighbors or show any measure of love to their neighbors because they were at the church all the time. And a few years ago, Jane and I said, this is silly. We've not been to a neighborhood association meeting. We have not in any way connected with anybody in our neighborhood because we're at the church all the time. Is that what God wants from us? And we said, no, the church activities need to be done with the idea that everybody should be encouraged to get into your community, your neighborhood. Love the people around you. Learn who they are. Learn what they're struggling with. Learn how to walk with them through their life. Don't judge them. Just love them. And so we said a couple of years ago, we were going to get to know our neighbors. And we stopped doing as many things at the church as we had done in the past so we could spend some time in getting to know our neighbors. Last week we had, I think, 8 or 10 from our neighborhood that was at church. Do they come every week? No, they don't come every week. But some of them are beginning to come, and we never pushed it on them. We just got to know them, love them, and they are slowly saying, you know what, if we don't have a church home, we'd like to come, and we'd like to hang out with you guys. My dream would be this. My dream would be that each of you in your neighborhood would have a group of people that you became such great friends with and you loved each other. And then for many of those friends who didn't have a church home, you would say, we have a big rally on Sunday morning. Come to our church on Sunday morning. And we would just celebrate. And we would have people from this neighborhood. Every neighborhood would be represented with a cluster of people. And it would just be a wonderful time as we celebrated God together. But we would all be doing it surrounded by people who live in our neighborhoods. Tell you a cool story. We have 2 ladies in our neighborhood, Sheila and A.T. Jane and I know them. We've been out to dinner with them a few times. Very, very interesting ladies. We love them very much. But I was reading on Facebook the other day, Sheila was writing, and she was cranky on Friday because she was cleaning up Thanksgiving mess. And so she says, I was in a cranky mood cleaning up Thanksgiving. And I'm thinking, oh, goodness, this is going to be a whiner kind of a thing. What is she going to say? And then she said this. We had 76 people in our home yesterday. 76 people in our home yesterday. That's right, 76 people who could have been any number of places doing any number of things, but they picked here. They chose to share this major holiday with us. Then she related some stories about the different people who were there. Some were neighbors, some were friends from work. She described some of the youth who had been rescued by the Lost and Found organization, which is a grassroots organization that tries to rescue LGBT kids who have been kicked out of their homes, who are living on the streets. So they had many of those kids there at their home for Thanksgiving. And she wrote about other people that were there. And then she closed with this. Now as I type this, I can hear my sweet little mama and my amazing partner laughing and talking in our beautiful kitchen in our warm house as they began to take apart everything that was put together to make yesterday the unique and powerful experience that it was. And by the way, Sheila's mom was worshiped with us last Sunday, and she wrote this, I'm not cranky anymore, but I am most definitely still very, very thankful. I am still very, very thankful. And you know what I thought? I thought we had 21 at our house. And I thought, I want to reach more neighbors. I want to get more neighbors over to our house. I want to share love like that, not just in a church building, but in my circle of neighborhood friends. Third thing, I need to meet strangers who need my love and have an open heart and help them when I feel God's nudge. That's what the story of the Good Samaritan was about. Jesus saying there's going to be times that you're going to see someone in need. You're not going to know them, but you're just going to know you're supposed to help them. Our compassion sometimes is very self-serving. I read this story this week and I thought it was cute. A young minister was sitting in his house on a Sunday afternoon and he was disturbed by the frantic banging on the front door. Upon opening the door, he was confronted by a distraught member from his congregation. It was obvious this person was exhausted from running to his house and was on the verge of tears. What's wrong? Asked the pastor. Please, can you help me? The person said, a kind and considerate family in the area is in great trouble. The husband recently lost his job and the wife cannot work due to health problems. They have 3 young children to look after and the man's mother lives with them because she is unwell and she needs constant care. They are one day late with the rent, but despite the fact that they have lived there for 10 years with no problems and will likely have the money later in the week, the landlord is going to kick them out onto the street if they don't pay the rent by the end of the day. That's terrible, replied the minister. Of course we'll make some of the extra church funds available to help them out. By the way, can I ask, how do you know them? Oh, replied the man, I'm the landlord. That takes a minute to get that, doesn't it? It just takes a minute. But some people are that way. They want to help, but then you find out there's kind of something coming back to them in the whole process. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about having eyes like Jesus had to see people right where they are. It means taking our eyes off of ourselves, which is hard to do, and putting our eyes on other people. I remember reading about a test given at the Harvard Divinity School for a course called Christians in Society. The professor had created a test that was 3 hours long, and it was a tough test on being a moral Christian in an immoral society. But halfway through the test, he arranged for there to be a break and for the people to go out into the courtyard and there to have some refreshments. And they did not know he also had placed a homeless person, very disheveled, also in the courtyard. And all of the seminarians in this course on how to be moral in an immoral world, after vigorously taking the first half of the test, went out there and got their lemonade and got their cookies, and they talked among themselves, and then they went back in and they sat at their desk, and the professor flunked every one of them because not one person even noticed the disheveled man who was sitting right in their midst, leaning up against a bench, obviously in distress. And it's so sad, but so often the church of Jesus Christ flunks the real test in our own lives. We know the answers to the questions, but we don't ever really show love. Well, some people ask obvious questions. What about the beggar I see every day at Kroger? What should I do about him? Or the person that's always standing on the street corner right when I get off 85 highway? What about him? Here's some different thoughts. Some people give every time. They just put money in their pocket and they just have a little extra money and they give it every time. That's their way of doing it. Some give other things, not money, because of the high rate of addiction among many homeless. So they don't give money, but they'll give a cup of coffee, or they'll get their leftovers from the restaurant. They'll make sure they get the biscuits they didn't eat or whatever, and they'll make that available. Some will say to the homeless person or the person that's begging, I give through my church or I give through Family Life Ministry, so I don't really have any more money to give, but is there anything tangibly I can do for you? Can I pray for you? And maybe just spend some time interacting. It's not what you do. God gives us different nudges. It's just making sure that you do, when you get that nudge, you do what you're supposed to do. Sometimes it's just being willing to stand up for people that society takes advantage of. I like Martin Luther King Jr.'s quote. It's my favorite of all of his quotes. In the end, King said, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. And so for me, when I know people that are going through hard times, I want to stand with them. But I think there are times when we just have a holy nudge and we're supposed to act. I want to end with one little story. A few weeks ago, I was talking to somebody in our church, a person in our church, who was in desperate need of a car. Some of you will relate, right? Person in desperate need of a car. Getting around by bus in Atlanta is not easy. Getting to a job sometimes would take an hour and a half by bus. But this person did it. This person also was trying to go to school, trying to do everything, trying to do it right. And so I was just talking to this person. I said, you need to save money for a car. We probably could get you a bombed car for $400 or $500. I'm guessing, I don't know, $400 or $500 maybe. And a friend of mine was here who doesn't go to our church, but he overheard me and he said, what's the story? I said, well, this person's on the bus all the time and really would love to see her get a car. So I'm just telling her she needs to save some money because none of us have any money, just asking her to save her money. And if she can get $400 or $500, we'll see if we can find a car. And he called me later in the day and he said, I left. And he said, I went to a place where a friend of mine owns a little business, and he's never told me if this guy's a Christian or not a Christian, but he said, I just told him the story, and he said he wants to give your friend a car. And y'all, it's not a bad car. It's not a clunker. It's like a really, really nice car. And so he's spending a little time getting it tip-top, but he said, therefore, she can take the money, $400 or $500 that she's saving, and she can use that for insurance. Then I get another call, and evidently the guy next door to this guy says, what are you doing with the car? And he said, well, I'm giving it to somebody. I don't know who it is, but I heard this story, and so I just want to give it. And the guy said, well, I'm an insurance agent. I don't want her to put her money on insurance. I'd like to cover her insurance for a year. Now, the car's not in her possession yet. They're still getting a few little last details just right. But I think in the next few days, that's going to happen. And I'll let you know. If it happened, I'll let you know. But what blows my mind, it's precious that a friend of mine is getting blessed like that. But it's also precious to me that somebody felt a nudge to do something. And they didn't talk themselves out of it by saying, well, that's too extravagant. I don't want to do that. I mean, he could have said, well, I'll just give her $400 so she can go buy a clunker. But that's not what he said. He said, I've got the means. I can provide a good car. And the other man said, I've got the means. I can provide the insurance. I'm just saying that because tomorrow morning you may wake up and you may pray that prayer, Lord, help me be a neighbor, and God may tell you to do something that seems a little crazy. Maybe it's buying somebody's meal in a restaurant that you don't know. Maybe it's giving somebody a tip way beyond a tip that you've ever given before. Maybe it's giving somebody something that means a lot to you, but you just feel like you're supposed to give it. Whatever it is, I want our church to be a church filled with good neighbors. I want you to be a good neighbor. I want you to bow your heads. I'm going to pray, and then we have one more thing we're going to do in the service. But I want you to pray, and then we'll be dismissed. But, Father, thank you so much for today. Thank you for every person who listened. Thank you for this thought of being a good neighbor. I pray it will be so real to us that we won't leave here thinking it's just about loving God. That's kind of nebulous. No, when we love God, we love others. We love them in our homes. We love those that live close to us. And we love when we feel that nudge from you that someone is in distress or might need a blessing, we just gladly bless them. Help us do that, oh God. And I thank you for this in Jesus' name. Amen.